The OSHA ETS rules are back in effect following a decision by the Sixth Circuit last Friday. We have everything you need to know to implement OSHA's new requirements for testing and masking next on Employment Law After Hours. So before we get to the rules on OSHA's ETS that are now in effect again, we do want to say we are attorneys, but we're not your attorneys yet. So take what we say here as informational purposes only. Also, please be advised things in this world are changing rapidly. So, always be following up, with your attorney.
Yeah, Brian. So on Friday, as some of you may know or may have seen, the Sixth Circuit overturned the stay of the Fifth Circuit regarding the mandatory vaccination or testing and masking of employers with 100 plus employees.
That's right, Monica. And it must be stated there is another appeal level that states can take to try to have the stay put back in place. I do think sitting here today, we can't guarantee what the Supreme Court will do, right, but I think it's unlikely the Supreme Court's going to overrule this decision. The Supreme Court has issued many decisions during the pandemic addressing masking, testing, vaccination policies, and they've pretty much always fall in line with those requirements. But for now, we do need to plan on these requirements going into effect on the dates that we're going to discuss here today.
Yeah, so I guess that really sort of leads to the who does this apply to?
So let's start. What does it mean for employers to have 100 or more employees? As Monica said, it only applies to those employers with 100 plus employees. That count includes all your full-time, part-time, and seasonal workers, so it does not distinguish between those classifications of employees. These rules will not apply to those workers who are 100% work from home, but they do go into that count for 100 employees.
Yeah, the OSHA ETS also discusses sort of employers that are lingering around 100 employees. It takes November 5th as the date of whether or not you've had 100 plus employees. Mm-hmm. If you drop below that, you're still required to comply. If you go above that, you're required to comply.
I think it's important to reiterate that November 5th date, if you go above 100 after that date, then you do need to implement the policy.
Yes,
but
if you go below it afterwards.
And even if you go below it afterwards, you need to have that policy in effect.
So really, if you're lingering around there, it's probably best practice just to take this for what it is and start implementing a policy.
So let's take a moment to address what does the policy actually state. Essentially, what the policy states is employers have two options. You can implement a mandatory vaccine policy for all of your employees, subject to religion and disability accommodations, which we have a prior episode covering, or you can implement a mandatory mask and testing policy for your unvaccinated employees. So essentially what that would require is your unvaccinated employees would have to get tested weekly. Beginning actually on February 9th is when the updated dates are going to go into effect for testing. But beginning on what we're telling our clients, January 4th, they would have to begin wearing masks at all times, right, except for when they're eating or drinking. Or if it's an employee who has their own office that they can close the door and it's floor to ceiling walls, they don't have to wear their mask when they're alone in their office. One of the questions I've been getting a lot is, well, when should we implement the testing? Meaning, do you do it on Monday? Do you do it on Wednesday? Do you do it on Friday? The thing that makes the most sense would be to do it on a Tuesday or Wednesday, just because that gives you time to have the COVID virus, increasing in your system to increase the likelihood of having an accurate test, especially for those employees who spend most time out of their house on the weekends. However, I think, and it's okay that they're doing this, but I think most employers will do a Monday. So in order to come back to work that week, you have to get tested over the weekend and then have negative to show up on work on Monday.
I think one of the biggest questions that we get from employers as well is who is responsible for paying for these tests.
Mm-hmm. Depending on the state that you're in, most employers will not need to pay for their employees to get tested. Now, there's a couple other states, namely California, that would require employers to pay for that testing, at least right now. But, for us here in Ohio, our employers are not going to be required to pay for their employees to get tested under the current rules.
Yeah, so if you happen to be watching this video and you're out of state, that's definitely something that you would want to check with your legal counsel or contact us on.
Another question we're getting a lot of is, if an employee has a religious or disability accommodation request to a vaccine, do those come into effect here? And the answer is, well, sort of. Obviously, if you don't have a mandatory vaccine policy, if you went with the masking testing route that we assume most employers will, you don't need to really evaluate for those accommodations because you're not mandating the vaccine. However, if you have an employee who comes to you and says, hey, my religion or my disability prevents me from getting the vaccine, therefore it's not fair to me to have to do the testing and masking, what happens? Well, in those cases, that employee because they are unvaccinated, will continue to have to do the testing, the weekly testing, and will have to continue to wear a mask, because that is the accommodation that's essentially given to them for being unable to get the vaccine. So masking and testing for everyone who is unvaccinated, regardless of that religion or disability accommodation.
Yeah, as Brian touched on earlier, we've already made a video on what it means for an employee to have a medical exemption or a religious exemption that would require an accommodation. But we've found, especially in the last few weeks, that those requests get to be pretty complex, pretty convoluted. There are some significant legal ramifications if you go the wrong way. And just make sure, whether you reach out to your own legal counsel, us, watch our video, just for informational purposes, but just make sure that you're taking all of the precautions if you're getting those exemption requests in.
Now, Monica, are you able to dive a little bit into kind of the enforcement? So a lot of, I think, employers can be asking, well, who's going to enforce this? How's it going to be enforced? Is anyone actually providing oversight, or can I just ignore this?
OSHA is providing oversight into compliance with their own ETS. And so essentially, the biggest penalty for noncompliance are going to be the fees, and those fees stack heavily. So, for example, if it's brought to the attention of OSHA, whether that's through a current employee, it is right around $14,000 per week per violation. So you can see how significantly those would stack if, for example, you are supposed to be complying and you've got a handful of employees who aren't complying, making sure that you're following, that you're staying up to date, that you're doing what you're supposed to be doing as an employer is really going to be, it's going to be the make or break for some people's bottom line.
I think one of the main ways that OSHA is going to find out about a non-compliant employer is through whistleblowers. So essentially, you have a lot of vaccinated employees who are upset that they're having to work side by side unvaccinated employees. Mm-hmm. Those vaccinated employees may be the ones who actually pick up the phone and simply call OSHA anonymously and say, hey, my employer doesn't have a policy in place. They're not enforcing weekly testing or mask wearing. And then OSHA is going to send that investigative agent to the employer to ask questions and to find out, to issue those fines. Those whistleblowers are who you're going to need to watch out for. And it's important to state, for those whistleblowers, they are protected under law. So they know that if you were to fire them, demote them, put them out on an unpaid leave, something along those lines, because they called OSHA, they're actually going to be protected, and they're going to be able to sue you for retaliation, for retaliating against them for blowing the whistle to OSHA. So there is that motivation there for those whistleblowers to come forward.
The best practice is to get in compliance with this, because either way, if you're not, you're looking at penalties from OSHA, or you're looking at potential lawsuits, You're looking at whistleblower claims, which could lead to lawsuits. It's a stackable issue if you're not taking the necessary precautions and you're not making the right moves now.
So in sum, employers need to have their policy and mask wearing in place by January 4th. If you decide to go with a mandatory vaccination route, definitely you're going to have that policy in place by January 4th as well, to allow people to get fully vaccinated by the February 9th deadline, which begins the testing. So testing will begin February 9th. Everything else start on January 4th, right after the holidays. And then a quick word about your policies. OSHA does provide kind of a template policy that you can utilize. So definitely consult with your employment attorneys regarding any provisions of that policy template that you can actually modify to tailor it to fit your company and your employees.
Yeah, and as always, Brian and I are here. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Our contact information is below. And, welcome back to Employment Law After Hours. We're excited to be back.
That's right. A little hiatus there, but here we go.
For sure. And happy holidays from both of us.